How do we frame what is the challenge of diffusion? And so what we're going to present to you is our initial thinking about defining the problem, defining the field of the problem. It's a bit more about the problem than the solution. We've tentatively put out some solution ideas, and we'd like to engage with you. And Simon wanted to emphasise kind of what level of thinking this is at so far and why this potentially is not quite in publishable hardback form.
Well, I was going to say, this is the thinking of colleagues over coffee and wine, and it's there to frame the discussion. So if you've got a copy at all of the framework, I'm not sure whether people have got it in front of you, if it would be worth pulling out. But if you do, can you just write version 1.0 on the top?
And here's the story that sets it up. This is most schools in Australia. And what we've got on the bottom is ICSEA, which is our measure of socioeconomic status. And up here, the performance. This is from ACARA. And each dot is a school. And what you can see is in Australia, the higher your socioeconomic status, the higher, on average, your performance is likely to be, which means, more or less, your postcode determines performance. But there's a lot of variability. And the good news, and where SVA takes its starting point, is these schools. These are the low socioeconomic schools that are getting great outcomes for their kids. We call them the bright spots. These are the schools that are showing us that it's absolutely possible. They're all performing at the level of the top socioeconomic schools that have, some would say, an easier time teaching the kids who are turning up to school probably on track already, and then keeping them on track. And imagine if we could lift a whole lot of these schools even halfway to that level, what that would do to the education system in Australia. When we look at those bright spots, in SVA language, there's a lot of common themes that underpin them. So we would suggest that part of the reason why they are bright spots is they have great leadership in those schools, not just the school principal, but the leadership team. They have really high quality teaching, consistently delivered to all students. And they take advantage of strategic school community partnerships that includes parental engagement, not-for-profit organisations, local government and other services. So if we know that about the bright spots, why don't we have more bright spots? Why don't we have a bright system?
And I think here is where originally we started thinking, what's the architecture of an evidence-based school system? And you start all the way from a university generation of knowledge through to implementation into practice. We sort of drew this up and we started thinking, well, wait a second, so much of the discussion is so much on what do we know about what works? Perhaps form a dialogues about what do we know what works about teaching practices? What do we know from the meta-analysis of school leadership that has an impact on student performance? But then we spend far less time on the other side of the diagram, how that actually gets into practice. And so as an experience, we just put our hand over and said, what if, just hypothetically, we assumed we knew things already about great practice in teaching, great practice in school leadership, great practice in community school partnerships, which, by the way, of course, we know we do. And asked ourselves, but when we know something and we still don't do it, what's going on? And we'd have a relaxed coffee and say, what happens in medicine and why is it that medical professionals know that washing their hands is crucial? And yet over and over again, nurses and doctors struggle to make sure that they do that simple activity to avoid infection rates. Or we thought about January and thought about the health commitments we might have made to ourselves. We knew it's 20 minutes of active exercise a day. Who's ever told themselves they'd do that? It's less coffee, more water. And then somewhere mid-February, that kind of fell off. We knew what we needed to do, but we didn't. And so as we mapped these, both inside and outside educations, we came to the conclusion that there were both limiting beliefs and behaviours that got in the way of either initiating the new practices or sustaining them to the point where they become embedded in practice.
So let's just go to one of my favourite belief barriers. And we've called it context mismatch. I don't know if this is going to resonate with people in the room, but it's people who believe that even though they know that that evidence exists, that their own context is so completely different that it wouldn't work in my class, or it wouldn't work in my school, or it wouldn't work in my community. So an example might be a New South Wales secondary maths teacher teaching in a public school who sees the example, often written as a case study or maybe a video vignette, of a Catholic primary school in Queensland who's getting fantastic student feedback that's leading to really high improvements in outcomes. And that secondary school maths teacher says, well, I'm not really sure that that's relevant to me because that's a Catholic school and it's primary school and it's in a different state. So what can I take from that? So that belief barrier of, because my context is different, what works over there is not going to work over here, we think is a big barrier to learning, particularly from case study examples.
And to perhaps give you an example from the other side of the diagram in the behavioural limitations that get in the way. And I think here we wanted to share our idea of cruise control. This idea that you know what to do, you know you want to do it, but you slip back into habitual habits. I'm actually a high school teacher by background. I was speaking with Narissa over dinner last night. We were talking about the learning that can happen when we look at our primary school colleagues about simple things of learning intentions and success criteria. We know this works. And I remember in my first year of high school teaching, I know I should do it. But the imprinting was so much on how I knew a science classroom would kick off at the start of every lesson. Even after a year, my habits of walking in, class sits down, opens the previous work, start copying this from what I was doing. I know my pedagogy wasn't great back then. But I committed to learning intentions. I was doing it mid-February, and somewhere during report writing season, the busyness of what was going, because I didn't change habitually my workflow processes, I just reverted back. And so I think here we're getting to the point that teaching is deeply routinized in its workflow processes. It might be similar to something like typing. I wonder how you type. Can everyone just show me how you type? We can see where there's touch typers in the room. Yeah, there's a touch typer. You see this? Straight away she knows what she's doing. Who here has a semi-version of touch typing and something else that's going on? And you committed at some point, I'm going to learn how to touch type, and then what happened? You had to write that essay, you had to write that email, and you said, I'm just going to stop. While I'm busy, I'll go to my hack, and then I'll go back to best practice. And for so many teachers, actually, it's that act of deep unlearning of routinized and perhaps even ritualized habits of behavior that get in the way of the practices they know they want to use, but they fall back into the ways they've done things before.
So we've tried to frame a couple of those belief barriers and behaviour barriers that we think represent a lot of the things that get in the way of, even with the best intentions when you know a lot about what works, why it doesn't eventuate in changing your practice consistently and reliably at the classroom or at the school level. And then we've had a go, and this is definitely the version 1.0 part, of developing up a bit of a framework for what we think you could do about it. And the key component for this is that we think this is a bit of a canvas that you can hang your thinking on. It probably doesn't have all the right components quite yet, but we hope that it'll be something that can stimulate your thinking. So the two pieces, one of them is the learning architecture. How do we design the processes for people to learn new practices? And how do we particularly make it easier for people to learn how to do the new thing, without assuming that just because you've read the paper or you went to the PD conference, that now you know how to do it in your own classroom every single day. And then the second bit
is the social learning processes. And this is to understand that, even though we have a lot of technology and new tools, the processes by which humans come to change their norms, beliefs and practices probably haven't changed in millennia. And what we're learning from some of the best practices of organisations that change is they steep that real clarity about what needs to be learnt and how it could be learnt in a culture of social learning, practices spreading from one person to another. Not like the flu, someone sneezes, a rock star teacher sneezes and hopes that it spreads to every other teacher. A great leader sneezes and hopes that practice moves, but really up close and personal to other people, sharing and co-constructing that practice. I think the only other point on this canvas is what we hoped is that it almost might be a bit of a Rosetta Stone, a kind of a way of people speaking about the similar stuff with a common language. And so I spoke to Robbie briefly and I said, what are your insights about the system here? He said, you're doing lots of the same things, but sometimes we call it something different. And so often we speak over the top of each other. And we're hoping that during the day you might be able to point and say, oh, I think the work I'm doing kind of fits in this bubble. It needs changing because it's version 1.0. I'll scribble on it and say what I would call it. But I'm sort of working here and someone else is working here. And we can have a common language and framework to talk about the interconnections of our work.
So just to dive into a couple of the examples within the learning architecture, these are the pieces that make it easier to learn how to do the right thing, because we're not all born knowing how to do everything at a master level. So how do we scaffold people into doing that? The first example that I'll point to is synthesizing the evidence into a usable format. And Kevin Collins from the Education Endowment Foundation will talk to us a little bit more about the importance of this, because teachers understandably, are not reading the primary literature, which is the academic journals that academics from one university write to each other in complex jargon with multisyllabic words in abstracts that have a little bit less grammar and commas than what I've just spoken. That's the kind of level that the academics speak to each other in, for good reason. But the teachers need to be able to access that evidence base in a way that is engaging, meaningful, and aligns with their own values so that they can see, what do we already know and how can we stand on the shoulders of giants about what everybody has already learned before me and start from that point. So I think that's an incredibly important starting point, is that we don't expect teachers to learn just by trial and error in their own individual classroom, especially given how many early career teachers we have who are learning these things for the very first time. Another example, and this is something that I've learned particularly from some of our colleagues in our Bright Spots schools, is the importance of giving time to learning the new thing. And allocating time, we think, could be done in intensive bursts, rather than just saying, oh, I don't have enough time, I need more time. Specifically allocating time for the learning of the new practice and doing it only for a particular period of time. And we think that that can help overcome, to some extent, what Simon was talking about with cruise control. I have the best intentions, it's just that I never quite get around to it because I don't have the time and the bandwidth to try. If there's dedicated time in the school timetable for teachers to attempt the new practice and to address the new practice, then we think we're more likely to be able to develop that and to start to build the new routines and habits that teachers will need to be able to do it consistently and reliably every time.
And I guess these processes have to sit within, we're talking about this culture of social learning. And here we turn to the work of someone like Dr. Atil Gawande, a surgeon from Boston who writes fantastically in the Atlantic and New York Times about the challenges of change, similar challenges we're talking about today in education and other areas. An article that really struck us as one of his ideas called Slow Ideas, why ideas, even in medicine, don't spread from one person to another, even if the evidence base is strong. And he writes this in his article: diffusion is essentially a social process through which people talking to people spread an innovation. People follow the lead of other people they know and trust when they decide whether to take it up. Every change requires effort, and the decision to make that change is a social process. We know that. I see people nodding around the room. We know that in our family life. We know that in our personal life. We know that in our work life. And so I think one of the points of social learning is to understand that we need to embed that clarity of what to learn and how to learn it within this social architecture. And so we've got some ideas about what this looks like. Many of you have written or have case studies of practice that would fit into these different areas. But to give one example, about providing feedback on progress and accountability. We've heard this many times, I'm sure. But when you speak to school leaders talking about the need for a culture of trust, non-judgmentalism in the first interactions, but once you're there, being able to get over perhaps that problem of cruise control because I've got someone who cares about my practice enough to be there. They'll be with me. But secondly, they're expert enough to provide me feedback about the changes in my processes. Because one of the challenges as a teacher, there's a long lag time actually before I get outcomes, change learning outcomes often from the change practices. And just like someone who perhaps is trying to fix their cholesterol, and it's multiple months before they get a new reading about whether or not they've made any progress or not, sometimes you start to question whether it's worth all the effort in between. And so to a teacher who's waiting long periods of time before they get student outcome data, actually they need regular data about the change learning processes from an expert teacher that might help them focus and continue to do that deliberate practice that we know is necessary.
So that's just a taste tester of our framework. We hope that it gives you a little bit of language to use throughout today to place particularly our guests from our international markets that we've got sharing their version around how they think about diffusion, and also our Australian examples that we'll be sharing in the breakout sessions. But more importantly, we'd love you to contribute to how we think about this differently. Please tell us either today or in follow-up conversations what's missing, what doesn't work, what doesn't resonate, and how can we improve on this? Because we believe, and maybe that's, I guess, a bias of an organisation like SVA, but we believe if we can get a good framework that gives everyone a common way of talking about this, that it'll help shape our practices and help us talk about how do we do that bit better. So thank you very much for letting us share our hypothetical thinking, and look forward to building on it with you.
Great.